When the Pacific burned and fleets vanished beneath black water, one ship refused to die. The USS Enterprise, a floating fortress of steel and soul, faced every storm the Japanese Empire could unleash. Bombs rained, torpedoes struck, and fires consumed her decks, yet she always came back, scarred but unbroken. They called her the Grey Ghost, because every time the enemy claimed her sunk, she reappeared, angrier, stronger, and ready to strike again. She fought at Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, the heart of every major battle that defined the Pacific War. And when all others fell, the Enterprise stood alone, carrying America's hope upon her battered decks. This is not just the story of a ship. It's the story of the unsinkable monster that refused to surrender, even when the ocean itself tried to drag her down. Long before she became legend, the USS Enterprise was just another name on a list, the seventh ship to bear it, launched into a world on the brink of war. No one could have known then that she would become the most decorated warship in American history, the ship that carried the nation's spirit through its darkest days. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, the Enterprise was out at sea, a twist of fate that saved her from destruction. But from that moment on, there would be no escape from destiny. She became the spearhead of America's fight across the Pacific, leading fleets through chaos and flame, returning again and again when others never came home. Her crew called her Big E, but to her enemies, she was something else entirely, a ghost that haunted the waves. This is the story of how a single carrier turned the tide of a world war, and how courage, engineering, and sheer defiance forged the unsinkable legend of the USS Enterprise. When the USS Enterprise first touched the water in 1936, few could imagine the role she would soon play in reshaping history. At the time, America was still struggling through the Great Depression, and war was something that happened oceans away. But in the quiet shipyards of Newport News, Virginia, engineers and shipbuilders were unknowingly forging the steel heart of a coming storm. Designated CV-6, the Enterprise was part of a new generation of aircraft carriers, faster, deadlier, and more flexible than the battleships that had once ruled the seas. She stretched 827 feet from bow to stern, carrying nearly 90 aircraft and a crew of over 2,000 men. But her true power wasn't in her engines or armor. It was in the spirit of those who would sail her, a brotherhood of mechanics, pilots, gunners, and navigators who believed that this floating city could take on the world. When she entered service in 1938, she represented the cutting edge of American innovation. Her flight deck gleamed, her hangars hummed with new aircraft, and her engines roared with the promise of speed unmatched by any ship afloat. Yet even as the Navy celebrated its new marvel, clouds were forming over Europe and Asia. Hitler was marching, and Japan's ambitions were growing bolder by the day. The Enterprise's early missions seemed routine, training exercises, scouting patrols, and goodwill visits across the Pacific. But those voyages were sharpening her crew, testing her systems, and preparing her for something no one yet dared to predict: total war. By 1941, tensions with Japan had become impossible to ignore. American intelligence was on edge, and the Pacific Fleet waited for the inevitable spark. The Enterprise found herself stationed between Hawaii and Wake Island, a critical link in the Navy's defensive chain. She carried aircraft, supplies, and most importantly, readiness. Then came December 7, 1941. The morning Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Enterprise was returning to Oahu after delivering aircraft to Wake Island. Her pilot spotted smoke rising over the horizon, the first signs of hell unleashed. While most of the Pacific Fleet burned in harbor, the Enterprise raced into danger, launching her planes to engage the enemy. Some of her aircraft were among the first American planes to strike back that day, fighting amid chaos and confusion. When she finally entered Pearl Harbor's shattered port, the sight was apocalyptic: battleships capsized, oil fires raging, and the water thick with death. Yet, through that destruction, the Enterprise remained untouched. Fate had spared her, and in doing so, handed her a burden unlike any other: vengeance. In the months that followed, the Enterprise became the tip of America's spear. She led raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, struck Japanese shipping lines, and carried the fight to an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. The world was still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, but the men aboard the Enterprise were already writing a new chapter, one of resilience, retaliation, and rebirth. It was in those first chaotic months that the crew began to sense something extraordinary about their ship. She moved through danger as if guided by unseen hands, surviving attacks and near misses with almost supernatural luck. Whispers began among sailors, that she was protected, chosen, perhaps even blessed. But history would prove it wasn't luck at all. It was willpower, the kind that no bomb or torpedo could ever destroy. The USS Enterprise had been born not just to fight, but to endure. And soon, the world would see what endurance truly meant. The year was 1942, and the United States was reeling. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the illusion of safety, and America's once proud Pacific Fleet lay crippled in the harbor's oily grave. But from those ruins rose a single ship, the USS Enterprise. She was no longer just a vessel, she was a promise that the United States would not bow. Under the command of Admiral William Halsey, the Enterprise became the Navy's sharpest blade. She struck first, striking fast and vanishing before Japan could respond. Her aircraft raided the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, catching the enemy off guard and proving that American resolve was far from broken. Each mission carried enormous risk, the Pacific was vast, and Japanese forces still dominated the seas. Yet the Enterprise seemed unstoppable, weaving through enemy waters like a phantom. Her first real test came during the Doolittle raid. Although the bombers that struck Tokyo launched from the USS Hornet, it was the Enterprise that provided the escort, the shield that kept them safe. When those brave crews dropped their bombs on the Japanese capital, it wasn't just a military strike, it was psychological warfare. Japan had believed itself untouchable, but now it knew, the war it had started had come to its doorstep. The Japanese sought vengeance, and their eyes turned toward the Enterprise. She became a marked ship, the target of every pilot who wished to avenge Tokyo's humiliation. Then came the Battle of Midway, the turning point of the Pacific War. It was June 1942. The Japanese Navy sailed with an armada meant to crush what remained of the American fleet. They had numbers, experience, and momentum. The Americans had only 3 carriers, Hornet, Yorktown, and Enterprise. The fighting was fierce and unforgiving. Planes screamed across the skies, dive bombers plunged into walls of flak, and the ocean itself seemed to boil beneath the fury of battle. In the chaos, the Enterprise's pilots struck hard, delivering fatal blows to the Japanese carriers Akagi and Kaga. The enemy's power began to crumble, and by day's end, 4 Japanese carriers lay burning. The Enterprise had not escaped unscathed, bomb splinters tore through her decks, and fires raged below, but she endured. Her crew fought flames, patched holes, and kept her planes flying. For her valor, she earned a name whispered across both sides of the Pacific, the Lucky E. But luck has its limits, and soon the Enterprise would test them all. In August 1942, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Japanese bombers found their mark. Explosions rocked her hull, men were thrown across the deck, and smoke poured from her bowels. Many thought she was finished. But the Enterprise refused to die. Damage control teams worked in near darkness, choking on fumes, sealing ruptured compartments with their bare hands. Within hours, she was operational again, scarred, limping, but alive. A few months later came the Battle of Santa Cruz, one of the bloodiest carrier clashes of the war. Bomb after bomb rained down on the Enterprise, tearing through her decks. At one point, a massive explosion ripped open her hangar, engulfing aircraft and crew alike. Even as she burned, her pilots continued to launch, fighting to the last breath. When the smoke cleared, the sea was littered with wreckage. The USS Hornet lay lost. The Enterprise stood alone, battered, bleeding, yet defiant. For the men aboard her, survival was no longer just chance. It was destiny. Every time she was hit, she came back. Every time she was counted out, she returned stronger. The Japanese began to whisper a name filled with both fear and respect, the Gray Ghost. Because no matter how many times they tried to sink her, she always came back from the dead. By late 1942, the USS Enterprise had become more than a warship, she was a legend that defied logic. Her decks bore scars from bomb blasts, her hangars carried the blackened memory of fire, and her crew wore exhaustion like armor. Yet, despite it all, she remained at sea. To the Americans, she was a symbol of resilience. To the Japanese, she was a nightmare that refused to die. After the brutal battles of the Solomons, many believed the Enterprise would be sent home for repairs or retirement. But the Pacific War had no mercy for rest. Instead, she was patched at sea, her hull bandaged, her decks reinforced with steel plates scavenged from wrecks. Within days, she was ready for combat again, a wounded beast reborn. When she re-entered the Pacific fight, sailors across the fleet cheered. It was said that wherever the Enterprise went, victory followed. Her presence became a talisman, a sign that the impossible might still be within reach. As the Allies pushed toward the Central Pacific, the Enterprise led the way, launching relentless airstrikes at enemy positions from Guadalcanal to the Gilberts, and then to the Marianas. Each battle seemed to push her closer to destruction, yet she survived them all. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Enterprise's air group tore through Japanese formations, decimating their carrier-based air power. Wave after wave of enemy aircraft fell from the sky, unable to break through her defenses. When the smoke cleared, more than 300 Japanese planes had been destroyed. The Enterprise had once again written her name into history. But her greatest trial came at Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles ever fought. Japan's last hope rested on a desperate gamble, a massive counterattack to destroy the American invasion fleet. The Enterprise sailed at the heart of it, launching strike after strike against enemy ships. Her aircraft crippled Japanese cruisers and sank destroyers, but she was once again marked for death. Kamikaze pilots, the new weapon of Japan's dying empire, began to target her relentlessly. They came in screaming, fire trailing from their wings, determined to sacrifice themselves to sink the Gray Ghost. On November 14, 1944, one of them succeeded. A plane slammed into her flight deck, erupting in flames and killing dozens. The explosion tore a hole through her steel skin, leaving her deck scorched and twisted. The Enterprise staggered. Smoke poured from her hull. For a moment, even her crew believed it might finally be over. But within hours, the men were fighting back, dousing flames, carrying the wounded, and clearing wreckage so planes could launch again. By the next morning, she was operational. It was madness. It was impossible. It was Enterprise. Her damage control teams became legendary, men who refused to surrender to fire or fate. One sailor wrote in his diary, "Every time we're hit, she just shakes it off. She's alive, I swear she's alive." By now, the Enterprise had been bombed, torpedoed, and kamikazed more times than any other American carrier, yet she refused to sink. Newspapers back home called her the Unsinkable Monster. Even Japanese intelligence began to question if she had some kind of supernatural protection. For the crew, she was no longer just a ship of steel. She was family, breathing, fighting, protecting them as much as they protected her. And as the war pushed toward Japan's doorstep, one truth had become clear: the USS Enterprise wasn't just surviving history, she was shaping it. By 1945, the Pacific War had reached its final, most desperate stage. The Japanese Empire was collapsing, yet its soldiers and pilots fought with the ferocity of men who refused to accept defeat. And at the center of that storm, once again, was the USS Enterprise. After years of constant combat, she was a veteran among ships. Her decks were scarred, her steel warped, and her paint blistered by heat and shrapnel. The ocean had tried to claim her countless times, but every sunrise found her still standing. To the men who served aboard her, she had become something sacred, a guardian that had carried them through hell and back. During the Battle of Okinawa, the Enterprise faced one of her greatest trials. Kamikaze pilots swarmed the skies in numbers greater than ever before. They didn't fear death, they sought it. Each one aimed to take the gray ghost down with them. The sky turned into a firestorm. Alarms blared. Gunners screamed coordinates through smoke and chaos. On May 14, 1945, one of those suicide planes broke through the defensive screen. It struck the Enterprise near the island's superstructure, triggering a violent explosion that tore through the ship's innards. Men were thrown into the sea, flames engulfed the flight deck. For hours, the crew battled the inferno with bare hands, torn hoses, and sheer will. Many thought this would finally be her end. But even then, even engulfed in smoke and agony, she refused to die. Damage control teams fought through the night, sealing compartments and clearing fires. When dawn broke over the Pacific, the Enterprise was still afloat. Broken, yes, but unbowed. It would be her final fight. The damage was so severe that the Navy decided to send her home for repairs. The war would end before she could return to battle. For the first time in years, the Enterprise was silent, her engines cold, her decks empty. As she sailed back to America, the men who had fought beside her lined the rails in silence, staring at the sea that had nearly swallowed them all. They knew she had done more than any ship could ever be asked to do. Across 20 major battles, she had sunk or helped destroy more than 70 enemy ships and nearly 1,000 aircraft. She had earned 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship in World War II. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, fireworks lit the sky, and people celebrated across the world. But in the quiet docks of Puget Sound, the Enterprise sat in solemn triumph, the ship that had survived everything. She had carried victory on her back. Yet, history can be cruel. In 1958, despite her unmatched service, the USS Enterprise was sold for scrap. Her steel, the very metal that had defied bombs and fire, was cut apart piece by piece. For her crew, it was a heartbreak beyond words. The ship that had refused to die was gone, not to battle, but to bureaucracy. Still, legends never truly end. The spirit of the Enterprise lived on in every carrier that followed, her name passed down through generations. When the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise, CVN 65, took to the sea in 1961, her crew carried a single motto: "We are the legacy." And so, the Enterprise still sails, not as a ship of steel, but as a symbol of endurance, courage, and the unbreakable American spirit. She was more than the greatest carrier of World War II. She was proof that even when the world burns, there are some things, and some spirits, that simply cannot be sunk.